You ever wake up one morning and realize the life you worked so hard to build isn't really yours? That's how I felt the day I stood in my driveway, staring at a bright orange ticket from my homeowners association, a fine for something as simple, as personal as my car. That ticket was more than a slip of paper. It was a spark, the beginning of a war I never asked for, but one I was determined to win. And if you had told me back then that this fight would end with me parking a tank in my front yard, I would have laughed in your face. But that's exactly what happened. And this is the story of how it all went down. Now, before I dive in, let me tell you this. If you've ever felt trapped by rules that make no sense, if you've ever wanted to see a bully get what's coming to them, then stick with me. Because you're about to hear how I took on the HOA, how I turned their power against them, and how I shocked my entire neighborhood. And if you love seeing arrogant HOA boards crumble under their own weight, make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Because trust me, you don't want to miss what comes next. My name doesn't matter as much as my story, but if you're listening, then maybe you'll understand why I did what I did. See, I wasn't looking for trouble. I wasn't trying to be the guy everyone talks about. I just wanted peace. That's all. After years of saving, years of long nights at work, years of dreaming about a place of my own, I finally got it. A little house on a quiet street. It wasn't a mansion, it wasn't perfect, but it was mine. And for me, that house wasn't just about walls and a roof. It was about freedom. No more landlords breathing down my neck. No more shared parking lots. No more worrying if next year's rent would push me out. It was stability, safety, the American dream in its simplest form. Or at least, that's what I thought. But dreams, they have a way of hiding nightmares. And my nightmare had 3 letters. HOA. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Homeowners Association? Fine. I figured they handled landscaping, maybe organized block parties, made sure the streetlights worked. Nothing to worry about. But I was wrong. So wrong. Because the HOA doesn't just keep order. They control. And once you're on their radar, once they set their sights on you, they won't stop. At first, it was little things. A note about my grass being too tall. A warning about leaving my trash can at the curb overnight. Petty stuff. Annoying, but whatever. I paid the fines, shook my head, moved on. But then they came after the one thing I loved more than anything else. The one thing I swore I would protect. My car. Now, I know what you're thinking. It's just a car. But to me, it wasn't. This car, this old beat-up classic, was a piece of my history. My father's car. The one he taught me to drive in when I was barely tall enough to see over the dashboard. The one we spent summers fixing together, knuckles scraped, oil under our fingernails. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't new. But it was mine. It was his. It was family. When my father passed, that car was all I had left of him. And when I parked it in my driveway, it wasn't just a vehicle. It was a reminder, a memory, a piece of him I refused to let go. But the HOA, they didn't see that. All they saw was an eyesore. It started with letters. Unregistered vehicle. Doesn't meet aesthetic standards. Must be stored in a garage. And each letter came with a fine. $50, 100, 200. At first, I tried to fight it. I wrote back, explained the situation. I kept the car clean, covered, maintained. But none of that mattered. To them, it was a target. And when I refused to back down, they escalated. I came home one evening, groceries in hand, only to find an empty driveway. My stomach dropped. My car was gone, vanished. And then I saw it, a notice taped to my door. Vehicle impounded per HOA regulation. That was the moment. That was the breaking point. I stood there, staring at that piece of paper, and I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't just about a car anymore. It wasn't about fines or letters or rules. It was about control. About them thinking they could take whatever they wanted, whenever they wanted, because they hid behind some rule book. And right then, I made myself a promise. I was going to fight back. And not just with angry letters or meetings. No, if they wanted a war, I was going to give them one they'd never forget. What I didn't know then, what none of my neighbors could have guessed, was just how far I was willing to go. Because what started as a fine over my car ended with me rolling a tank into my yard. They took my car. It's a sentence that still tastes bitter in my mouth. Not because of the loss of metal and leather, though that stung enough, but because they'd taken a piece of me, They'd taken a memory. They'd crossed a line you aren't supposed to cross with another person's past. When I saw the impound notice on my door, my hands were full of groceries. I remember the way the bag tore a little in my grip and oranges rolled out onto the porch like tiny suns. For a second, I stood there and pretended everything was normal, the way you do when you don't want to accept the shape of a nightmare. Then I read the notice. Vehicle impounded per HOA regulation. It said, in clinical, indifferent type. No explanation. No apology. Just a statement of fact, as if they hadn't just taken something that had been in my driveway for 15 years. I called. I argued. I sat through the polite, practiced responses you get from people who work from scripts. We followed procedure. You had prior notices. Please pay the impound fee to recover your property. Fees. Notices. Procedure. They wrapped power in paperwork and handed it to me like a gauntlet. I felt ridiculous, arguing with a printed form. But I wasn't arguing with a piece of paper. I was arguing with the idea that someone could erase years of history with a stamp. People imagine rebellion as some romantic grand gesture. The truth is more mundane. The first week after that notice, I slept 3 hours a night. I read every clause in the HOA documents until my eyes blurred. I documented every interaction. I filed complaints. I sat in a tiny room at the HOA office with its cheap coffee and its board receptionist and demanded to see the board. I sat in board meetings where neighbors shuffled papers and smiled, and I listened to the same rehearsed lines about community standards. And while I demanded, I was also watching. I watched how their words matched their actions. I watched the way they used trivial infractions. A car not in a garage, a trash can left out, a lawn that dared to be an inch too long as tools. Each little penalty was a cog in a machine meant to grind people down until they complied, until they paid, until they stopped resisting. They started small because small things hide large intentions. First a fine, then a tow, then an escalation. Letters turned into threats. Threats turned into legal motions. Somewhere along the way, the notice about my car became a catalog of humiliation, a public embarrassment masquerading as rules enforcement. Neighbors who had smiled at the mailbox now glanced away if I caught their eyes. I lost friends who said they supported me but were afraid of repercussions. One elderly man who'd once shared fishing stories with me at the corner store crossed the street when he saw me coming. And here's the thing. The HOA didn't attack because they hated my car. They attacked because it was an opportunity. The car's presence in my driveway was a visible challenge to their authority. It said in a stubborn, greasy voice, this is my property. A bureaucracy built on control. Dissent is a wound. I won't pretend the anger didn't cloud my sense for a while. It did. I would stand in my kitchen and watch my driveway from the window, imagining all sorts of humiliating things happening. A tow truck operating in the middle of the night, the car hauled away on a flatbed in front of a crowd of judgmental neighbors. Each scenario tightened a knot in my chest. When the car was finally returned, after a larger fee than I could comfortably pay and after humiliating paperwork, it came back with a note stuck to the windshield: this vehicle is non-compliant. Keep in garage or face further action. They basically told me, keep it hidden or we'll use the law to make you disappear. I thought about hiding the car. I thought about letting it sit in a garage, covered in a tarp like an embarrassing secret. But I couldn't. It wasn't a vehicle to me. It was a memory-laden relic that deserved sunlight, deserved to sit proud in my driveway. Letting it be tucked away would have been surrender. I swallowed my pride, and also I swallowed a plan. I started small with a plan. I documented everything. I filmed the driveway, the damage from people stepping on the lawn, the notes, the towing notices. I saved every single communication. I learned every single code in our HOA bylaws. I found the cracks in their armor, the places where their rules contradicted something in the county code or where their bookkeeping didn't match their claims. But rules are slow. The HOA had lawyers. They could stall, drag, chill a man into exhaustion. I discovered that when you're dealing with institutions, the law is not always the swift hand of justice. Sometimes it's a molasses slow machine that favors the well-funded. I had a job, a mortgage, a life. I didn't have the time or the budget for years of litigation. I started a dream, even bolder. Sometimes, when a plan feels wildly disproportionate to the affront, it's because the offense itself feels personal beyond reason. That's what was happening with me. The car had become a symbol, and I'd become a man in love with a symbol. The more they pushed, the more ridiculous my thoughts became acceptable. On a late Thursday night, pacing the living room floor like a man possessed, I found myself on a forum late at night. The kind of place where people swap bizarre stories and illegal but not illegal ideas, and someone mentioned surplus auctions. Military surplus. Old tanks, armored personnel carriers, that sort of thing. I laughed like anyone would when they first read the idea. A tank? In my yard? It was absurd, but the laughter was hollow. I went to bed with the image in my head. A hulking, absurd object in my yard that made a statement so loud it drowned out the HOA's petty rules. It wouldn't be legal in a lot of places, I knew that. It wouldn't be tasteful to some, but the idea lodged itself in me the way an itch refuses to be soothed. It represented audacity. It represented, more than anything, the refusal to cower. The next week, I scoured listings. Military surplus sales. Online auction houses. A private collector here, a war museum there. I called people I'd never spoken to before. I learned the language of tanks, holes in turrets, calibers, and make years, as if I'd enrolled for a crash course in armored vehicles. It took time. It took cash I didn't have sitting in a pile. It took bargaining and awkward phone calls. But on an overcast Tuesday, I found one, an old, decommissioned light tank from a foreign military, sold by a broker who'd handled decommissions before. The listing was terse. M60A3 variant, non-operational main gun. Runs, requires transport. The photos were grainy but convincing. Old, heavy, ridiculous. Perfect. Logistics marched in like a second reality. Buying a tank is not like buying a car. You need a broker who knows import laws, who can sign off on deactivation certificates and ensure the weapon system is beyond use. You need a transport company because that thing doesn't fit through a normal driveway. You need a place to store while you get permits, if permits apply, or at least a plan that skirts the edges of the law in a way you can justify. I lied about a lot, not because I took pleasure in lying, but the people I started dealing with insisted on plausible deniability. I said I wanted it for film production. I said I wanted it as a museum piece. I signed forms swearing it would be displayed at a private event. None of that mattered once the money cleared. The tank's ownership was transferred to me, with a stack of deactivation paperwork and a broker's invoice that smelled faintly of diesel and old paperwork. Then came the cost of moving it. The company that would haul a tank doesn't operate on schedule me for a Tuesday. It operates on contracts and escort vehicles and city permits. The transport firm quoted me a price that made my stomach drop. Wagons full of men in reflective vests, an oversized load permit, police escorts maybe, depending on the route. It would take specialized cranes to lift, flatbeds to carry, and crews to guide it in the dark. I scraped my savings, and I borrowed from friends who could be trusted not to ask too many questions. It felt reckless in a way the HOA would never understand. They measure life in violation notices that I measured it in heartbeat and memory. The day the tank arrived was an exercise in surreal logistics and quiet theater. A flatbed as long as a bus appeared before dawn. The street was oddly still, as if the neighborhood itself were holding its breath. I watched from my kitchen window, the blinds cracked, the kettle whistling like a character in a play. It felt like a scene out of the movie. Men in reflective vests barking coordinates, a crane's metallic groan, hydraulic hissing. The tank was lowered with the kind of care usually reserved for antiques. I had imagined a far clumsier arrival, but the crew moved with professional, wary respect, as if the iron beast had dignity even in disarmament. Neighbors peeped from behind curtains. I'd heard a window slam on one side of the block and a phone start to buzz on another. The HOA president came out in his robe, hair sticking up like a man who'd been woken by an alarm clock and realized the world had spun. He bellowed something about permits and public safety, his voice small over the diesel idling near my mailbox. I stood on my porch while men lowered the tank into place like a wedding cake from the heavens. When the treads kissed my grass, Little clouds of dew puffed up and evaporated in the morning light. The machine loomed in my yard, heavy and absurd and impossibly real. It sat like a monument to audacity and stubbornness and grief. The HOA called the police within minutes. I watched the squad cars arrive and park on the wrong side of the street, trying to block an event that was technically legal, at least as far as anyone could tell from the paperwork I'd been given. Uniformed officers walked slowly toward the front yard, their faces a mix of curiosity and consternation. I had my paperwork with me. I had the deactivation certificate, the bill of sale, the broker's receipt. The tank was decommissioned. The main gun pin had been removed. It shot nothing. It was a hunk of history by the letter. I greeted the officers politely and explained the situation. I didn't shout. I didn't brag. I explained that I had lawful possession. I explained that it wasn't operational. I explained that I'd taken extreme measures because the HOA had left me with no other recourse. The lead officer read my documents and looked at the tank the way you look at a painting that doesn't match the frame. "Sir," he said, "we might have to get a code inspector out here." He sounded unsure, like he'd been dropped into a new world where suburban disputes had armor plating. The HOA president kept yelling from his lawn, "You can't do this to this neighborhood. It's a hazard our property values." Property values. They always come back to property values. You could have told him that a tank protects memories, not market metrics, and he wouldn't have heard it. To him, the yardscape was money. To me, it was everything else. That morning, the local news vans arrived like vultures. I remember the cameraman kneeling in my yard, framing the tank like a strange new monument. I answered their questions with the calm of a man who has rehearsed his motive until it's honest. "They fined me for my car," I said into the microphone. "They took my car. They tried to hide my memories in a garage, and I'm not having that. If a tank is what it takes to make them stop, then a tank it is." The clip went viral in the small, provincial way these stories do. Overnight, strangers called my house to offer support, to say they'd been through the same. A few offered legal help. Several offered to bring food. The internet, always hungry for spectacle, tore the story apart and stitched it into 1,000 angles. "He's a hero," said one headline. "He's a menace," said another. My inbox bloomed with messages from strangers, some poetic, some obscene. But there is a difference between a spectacle and the consequences that follow. The tank was theater, yes, but theater with teeth. It drew attention in a way that made the HOA uneasily visible. When you illuminate the power center, the things they try to hide become exposed. The HOA didn't like the glare. They responded with petty cruelty and calculated legal pressure. Their first move was an emergency meeting. Board members convened at the community center and invited media. The president spoke about community norms and safety hazards and called in a code enforcement officer who read a list of citations from a clipboard with the kind of sanctimony you only see when people believe their own PR. The county inspector came out with a clip-on badge and a tape measure and looked at the tank with a professional distance that suggested he'd seen stranger things in his tenure. He measured the setback from the curb, the clearance from utility lines. He wrote notes. He spoke slowly about zoning. He told me I might need a variance. He left with a stack of forms and a promise to consult with the county attorney. The county attorney was polite in their letter. "We are reviewing the matter and will be in touch," it said. Translation: "We're looking for a way for you to be removed without a public spectacle of their own that could turn into a PR disaster." Meanwhile, the HOA dug in legally. They threatened me with fines that would grow daily until the tank was removed. They claimed it was an unauthorized structure, a hazard, a blight. Their lawyers sent letters with the kind of language that makes people sign things without reading them. Remedies, injunctive relief, court orders. They wanted the tank gone, but each move they made was also a story tactic. The more they threatened, the more headlines I got. It's worth saying something here about public spectacle. It cuts both ways. The same news vans that turned me into a character also turned me into a target. The more people who came to take photos and post about it, the more the HOA felt the heat to act. They began to feel like a pack cornered by a single, stubborn thing. Neighbors reacted in ways that made me understand the messy nature of community. Some joined me, bringing casseroles and folding chairs. A few teenagers came and posed for photos on the tank's armor, laughing and high on a kind of petty joy. The elderly couple 2 houses down brought a plate of cookies and a note that simply said, "We remember, and we stand with you." That note was more moving than the applause. Others gossiped and feared, and the PDA moms whispered about potential trespassers and risk to children. Some avoided me as if my yard was contagious. The HOA sent out an email to the neighborhood with photographs of our community under threat and asked for donations to fight back. The tension mounted into a slow hum that vibrated inside me. I slept less. I lived more. I was living through a narrative, and for the first time in a long while, the plot seemed to belong to me. But narratives have costs. The court threatened an injunction. The county inspector's final warning arrived on a rainy Thursday. "You must remove the unauthorized structure within 72 hours, it read. Their language had become sharper, more precise. At one point, a man I'd never met, a grizzled fellow with a small legal practice and a temperament I respected, called me on the advice of a friend. He counseled restraint. "You can win this," he said, "but you don't win by throwing yourself into prison. Let's handle this through restraining orders and town council. Let them be the foolish ones who sue. Let their finances do the work." I considered his advice. I even tasted the austerity of it. There were nights I pictured the tank being hauled off by a city wrecker, my front yard stripped bare and respectable once again. I pictured a judge looking at the paperwork and declaring my argument a performance art piece without legal merit. And yet, time and time again, I thought of the look on the towing guy's face when he first drove off with my car. I thought of the note on my windshield. I thought of my father, whose hands had taught me the torque of an engine and the stubbornness that comes with being a man who knows how to keep what is his. I'd been patient in the way a knot holds tension before it snaps. Keep the tank, my brain would tell me when I was tempted to concede. Keep it until they can't ignore it. And so I decided to play the long game and the bold one at once. I would defend the tank publicly, legally, and culturally. I would make it a symbol that turned their attempts at bureaucratic erasure into an object lesson in small government overreach. I would invite scrutiny, and I would make the narrative uncomfortable for them. I held a neighborhood barbecue on a Sunday afternoon, a block party designed less for politics and more to humanize what folks already wanted caricature. We invited neighbors, the local paper, and a few civic leaders who were more interested in votes than in HOA alliances. I parked the tank in the yard and painted a makeshift sign on it that read, "Memories, handle with respect." I hired a local band. Kids wore helmets and clambered on the tank under careful supervision. A woman brought a letterboard that read, "Remember why we live here." It felt subversive and tender at the same time. The media came. A local anchor interviewed me, and I told the story plainly. They fined me for my car. They took my car. I wanted to show them, and show everyone, that things that matter to people aren't always about curb appeal. Sometimes they're about memory. The turnout was bigger than I dared hope. Suddenly, an issue that had been a petty HOA squabble became a small-town controversy. People who'd never thought about bylaws started to think about who gets to decide what our neighborhoods look like. It complicated the HOA's PR. They responded by ratcheting up. They filed an emergency petition for a restraining order to have the tank removed. They hired a PR firm that specialized in cleaning up suburban messes. They reached out to community leaders telling a story of safety and property values and the sanctity of our neighborhood. An editorial in the paper called me an attention-seeking homeowner in a column that tried to be balanced and came off as scolding. I wasn't naive. I knew I was a showman now. I wasn't proud of everything I'd done. Sometimes I worried that I'd turned my grief into theater and lost the pure edge of the original injustice. But every time I saw a kid climb onto the tank and grin, or saw a neighbor sit on my porch and tell stories of their own family relics, I thought maybe spectacle was sometimes a useful tool to unmask small tyrannies. The legal battle dragged. We exchanged filings. I attended mediation meetings where men in suits spoke of community standards as if they were universal truths. I sat across from the HOA's lawyer, feeling very small in a room filled with multiple copies of corporate stationery. But the more proper the room, the more my message leaked out into the public. When you're the underdog and you're also the spectacle, sympathy sometimes becomes a kind of currency. It is a strange feeling to be both the target and the center. You learn quick to take the small victories as if they were large. A phone call from an anonymous neighbor who said "we're with you" felt like a draw in some gladiatorial contest. The county inspector's indecision felt like a reprieve. A judge's request for a more thorough hearing felt like a pause in a storm. I will not romanticize it. There were nights when I lay awake thinking about money running out, about what would happen to the mortgage if fines stacked until I could no longer manage. I worried about the kids who'd clamber on the tank and fall. I worried about a single lit cigarette near the gasoline scent that still clung faintly to the rusted metal. I worried about losing everything. The fear was real and heavy. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to move forward regardless. And then, on a blustery Wednesday, when the leaves were turning and the light had a hint of winter, the HOA did something that changed the game. They started leaving anonymous envelopes on my car windshield. Inside were photographs of my family, photos taken from angles that meant someone had walked the property line at night with a camera. They included a note: "We know where you sleep." Something inside my chest tightened in a way different from legal threat. This was intimidation that was not bureaucratic, but personal and meant to unsettle. The police took the photos. So did I. The camera lens had captured grainy images, faces none of us could clearly identify, but the message was unmistakable. A meeting convened at my house that night with neighbors who were starting to feel the pressure themselves. A few families joined me on my porch, and we discussed what it meant to live in a place with a board that escalated from rules to raids on privacy. We considered a neighborhood petition. We considered a press conference. We considered calling national civil liberties groups. In the end, we did all of it. We found lawyers who took donations or payment plans. We spoke to a local reporter who ran a piece about intimidation and privacy. The story expanded from one man and his tank to a community pushed by an overreaching board. But expansion brings consequences. The HOA doubled down. They filed more legal documents. They used every tool in the bureaucratic toolbox. They told the county that the tank was a traffic hazard, that it posed environmental risks, that it violated 1,000 tiny clauses. They argued their case with a kind of righteous fervor that made them appear sensible in the right courtroom and monstrous in the wrong column inches. Our court hearing was set. The courtroom smelled like a mixture of old wood and cheap disinfectant. The judge was a woman with a single, piercing stare and a calendar full of other people's disputes. We presented evidence. They presented evidence. The gallery was small, but it was filled with neighbors and media. I sat in my suit and felt my father's look on me like a hand on my shoulder. The judge asked me, "Sir, are you claiming this tank is essential to your personal property?" I remember the sentence because it felt like a ridiculous question. No, I told her, but I'm claiming my right to display what I own on my own property. This tank is my protest and my symbol of standing up to a process designed to make us invisible. The judge listened. She studied the law. She read precedent. She asked for evidence that the tank was not a safety hazard, which we produced, and she requested a final hearing in 2 weeks to study the written arguments. She stayed neutral in the way judges must. 2 weeks is both an eternity and a blink. In those days, everything was magnified. Each phone call, each new letter, each breath of wind felt like part of a long story being written in a hand that preferred small print. And then, on the morning before the final hearing, something happened that made the stakes feel raw again. I came outside and found my mailbox shattered, the metal bent like a pretzel. The newspaper that normally sat folded inside was gone. My father's photograph, the one I kept on the dash of that car, and which I had framed at my kitchen window, was missing from my front porch where I had placed it a night earlier, the frame empty and glass cracked on the ground. This was escalation that had crossed a line. When I called the police, when I called the reporter, when I called the neighbors, I realized how much we had all been dragged into a story that neither party had fully intended. People who had once been neutral were now choosing sides. People who had once been apathetic were now watching closely. For better or worse, my front yard had become a mirror for how power operates in quiet places. I slept on the porch that night because the house felt too small somehow. I watched the tank like a sleeping animal and thought about the next day in court. I thought about what would happen if we lost. I thought about what would happen if we won. I thought about the man who delivered my car years ago and the way his hands have been steady. I thought about my father and the way he taught me to keep my head down and my hands steady when changing a stubborn bolt. The court day arrived, the gallery filled with a kind of public interest that felt both exciting and terrifying. The judge read through stacks of filings. The HOA's lawyer used phrases like community integrity and precedent in the tone of someone reciting lines he'd practiced in a mirror. My lawyer, the one who believed in the power of the narrative and in the human face of grievance, spoke plainly. He said, "This is about a community that forgot it serves people first." He asked the judge to consider whether rules should exist to protect life or to protect a particular board's view of the world. The ruling? It was complicated. The judge denied a temporary injunction demanding the immediate removal of the tank, which felt like a win. But she also asked for more formal hearings to determine if the structure truly violated code in a way that justified removal. In other words, the tank could stay for now, but the end game wasn't decided. We left the courtroom feeling both buoyed and nervous. The public attention was a shield and a spotlight all at once. That night, as I walked back to my yard under a sky blotted with city light, I felt something odd, a fatigue that was less about the weight of the metal under my feet and more about the realization that theatrics only buy you time. They do not replace the slow, grinding mechanics of law and life. But they do change narratives. If you'd asked me then whether I had any regrets about parking that absurd, improbable piece of history in my yard, I would have said no. The tank had done what I'd wanted it to do. It made people look. It made people talk. It turned a spoof of an injustice into a conversation about power. But it also made me a spectacle, and spectacle comes with costs not easy to pay. The next morning, a note slid under my door at dawn. A single piece of paper with the words, "You've made enemies," scrawled across it. And beneath the words, someone had drawn a small, crude tank with a line through it. They wanted me to stop. They wanted me to be quiet. They wanted me to go back to a life where small rules could be used to erase memory. I read the note and crumpled it up and put it in my pocket like a talisman. Then I went to the driveway and climbed into the driver's seat of my car, the one they'd once taken. I placed my palm on the dash where my father's fingerprints had long since worn away the texture. I breathed in the smell of old vinyl and oil and, for a moment, allowed myself something approaching peace. Even if I lost a fight, I had provoked a question. Who gets to own a neighborhood's future? And who decides what memories are worthy of sunlight? The fight was only beginning. The tank had made the message impossible to ignore. But if you think a public stunt is the same as a plan, you haven't been awake late at night counting the cost. We were about to learn how deep the machinery of small-town governance could dig into a man's life. And if you're still with me, if this story has made you ache a little for the ridiculousness of human stubbornness, then here's a note for what comes next. Things got meaner. And the HOA found a different way to strike back, one that would test every legal, moral, and human line I'd left. But that's another chapter. I wish I could tell you that I cooled off after they took my car, that I let the anger fade, paid the fine, and moved on with my life. That would have been the easier road, the safer one. But that's not me. And honestly, it's not what they deserved. When I got my car back from impound, it looked like it had been dragged through hell. Scratches across the paint, a dent in the fender, the inside reeking of mildew because they'd left the windows cracked in the rain. And the bill? Over $500 in fees. I remember standing there, holding that invoice, my hands shaking. It wasn't just the money. It was the principle. They thought they could break me, humiliate me, make me roll over and accept whatever they threw my way. But I wasn't going to roll over. I was going to push back. The first thing I did was show up to the next HOA board meeting. And let me tell you, those meetings are a circus. Rows of folding chairs in the community center, coffee in styrofoam cups, a long table with the board members sitting up front like royalty. I walked in late, carrying a folder stuffed with every violation notice they'd ever sent me. Every letter, every photo, every fine. I dropped it on the table so hard the papers spilled across the floor. The room went dead silent. The president, a smug, balding man with a permanent scowl, adjusted his glasses and said, "You're out of order." And I said, "No, you're out of line." I laid into them. I told them about my father's car, about the history behind it, about the way they towed it without notice, damaged it, and slapped me with bogus fees. I could feel the neighbors behind me shifting in their seats, whispering, some of them nodding, some of them shaking their heads. And when I finished, the president just smiled. That smug little smile. He leaned back in his chair and said, "Rules are rules. If you don't like it, maybe this isn't the neighborhood for you." That was it. No apology. No sympathy. Just arrogance. I walked out of there that night with a fire in my chest, and I swore I'd never let them push me around again. But the thing about the HOA is they don't forget, and they don't forgive. A week later, I got another letter, this time about the paint on my shutters. Faded. Not within community standards. Another fine. Then it was the trash can again. Then it was the mailbox. Every few days, a new notice. A new fee. It was like they had a spotlight on my house, just waiting for me to slip up. I started noticing people driving past slow, taking photos, board members walking their dogs right past my property every evening. They weren't subtle. They wanted me to know I was being watched. At first, I tried to fight back the normal way. I documented everything, took photos, recorded dates, even talked to a lawyer, but he just shook his head and said the HOA had broad authority. That phrase stuck with me. Broad authority. Basically, it meant they could do almost anything, and unless I had deep pockets to fight them in court, I was stuck. But I'm stubborn, and I don't back down. So if they wanted to play games, fine. I'd play. I started small. I fixed the shutters, but painted them a color just barely within their approved palette. I moved my trash bins inside the garage within minutes of pickup just to deny them the chance to find me. I trimmed my grass twice a week. But no matter what I did, they found something. That's when it hit me. This wasn't about rules. This was personal. They wanted me gone. And if they wanted a war, I was going to give them one. I started researching, looking for stories about other people who'd fought their HOAs. Some fought in court. Some moved away. Some just gave up. But then I stumbled across something different. Something crazy. A story about a guy who bought a military surplus vehicle. Not just a Jeep, not just a truck, a tank. At first, I laughed. It sounded like a joke. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. The HOA wanted to fine me for my car? Fine. I'd give them a vehicle they couldn't ignore. I spent nights glued to my laptop, digging through forums, auction sites, anything I could find. And then, one evening, I saw it. An M60 Patton tank, retired from service, sitting in a surplus lot states away. It wasn't cheap, and it wasn't practical, but it was real. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do. They told me it was impossible. Friends who loved me said I was crossing a line. Strangers on the internet told me I'd go down in infamy or worse. But when an institution claws at something that holds memory and meaning for you, impossible becomes a dare. And I am not good at letting dares go unchallenged. The hunt began the way most modern obsessions begin, with a screen and a search bar at 2 in the morning. I scoured sites that sold the weird and the retired, forums where collectors traded tips, auction pages where people offloaded giant hunks of history with minimal fuss. I learned to read listings for what they were: terse, coy, and full of euphemism. Non-operational main armament meant the gun was disabled, but the vehicle still moved. Runs with maintenance meant you would be a mechanic and a caretaker, not an owner of an ornament. The broker I finally connected with had the tone of someone used to people calling with unlikely fantasies. He didn't laugh. He simply asked the logistics questions. Was I prepared for transport? Did I understand the need for deactivation and paperwork? Could I afford the cranes and flatbeds? I told him yes. I told him I could. And I lied a little about the budget, not because I wanted to deceive, but because once you start down a ridiculous path, the only honest thing to do is walk all the way through. Price was just the beginning. There were decommissioning certificates, a chain of custody that had to be laid out so a county official wouldn't bat an eye. I paid more money than I cared to admit to the broker, who in turn arranged for a salvage yard to confirm the tank's main weapon system had been rendered inert. The broker sent me a packet of antiquated stamps and forms that smelled faintly of oil and old leather. The sort of documents that feel like proof only until you truly need a legal hero to vouch for them. Transport was the real beast. Tanks do not fit a standard driveway. They do not roll down a street without notice. They need escorts and permits and an engineering plan for every bridge and underpass they might cross. The transport company I hired walked me through an arsenal of obstacles. Oversized load permits, police escorts, crane operators at the origin and destination. We worked out a route that avoided the downtown underpass, which had a weight restriction, which meant we would pass through residential roads at a time when people would still be asleep. Most people would have chosen to quietly place a ridiculous thing on an empty piece of land miles away from a neighbor's petition. I wasn't most people. I wanted the tank in my front yard, where the people who'd taken my dignity could see it every day. I wanted them to feel the absurdity and the shame simultaneously. The day of transport was claustrophobic and surreal. I woke before dawn and sat in my truck watching for the convoy. There was a hush over the neighborhood, like the sky had been instructed to be respectful. When the flatbed finally turned the corner and pulled up in front of my house, it was as if a film crew had arrived, but nothing about this moment was staged. The truck's engine whined as men shouted and cranes creaked like old timbers. A line of amber lights bobbed down the street, and the whole load looked like an archaeological artifact being lifted into place. They lowered the tank with a careful, solemn expertise. When its tread finally settled onto the earth, a hush settled over the street. The tank sat there, enormous and immobile in the first light, a black silhouette against the morning sky. I remember the way the dew steamed off its metal-like breath. Neighbors came out, eyes wide, coffee mug still in hand. Some cross-checked us like we'd broken a visual code for decent living. Others laughed and shook their heads. The HOA president came stomping out of his house that was 2 doors down, wearing his bathrobe like armor. He shouted about permits and safety codes, but he was small next to the bulk of that machine. I watched him gesticulate until his voice was hoarse, and the sound of the diesel idling behind me seemed to swallow his complaints. We had our paperwork. I handed the lead officer the broker's deactivation certificate, the bill of sale. He squinted at the numbers like a man reading a foreign language. He called the inspector from the county, who drove out slowly and measured clearances and checked the paperwork against a list of codes that felt incomprehensible to me in their specificity. "What's your purpose with it?" the inspector asked, clipboard in hand, the pen poised like an instrument of judgment. "This is mine," I said. "It's on my property. It's a piece of my history, my protest. It's something that matters to me." He looked at me with a professional neutrality that could be hiding a smile. "We'll have to review the documents and issue a temporary permit at best." The local news arrived within hours, attracted like flies to novelty. A reporter with a cheap microphone leaned forward and asked me the same question everyone wanted to know. "Why a tank?" she said, voice both amused and incredulous. I told her the simple truth. They fined me for my car, took it, and when the people in charge treat your memories like trash, they will discover how stubborn a person can be. That answer was the guts of everything that followed. People wanted either to laugh at me or to praise me. There wasn't much in between. The video clip went up on the local news page and spread through the internet like a small forest fire. Comments tumbled in, admiration and condemnation, advice and threats. "You'll get arrested. You're a hero. Remove it before it costs you your house. Please, for the love of the neighborhood, don't be the person who ruins resale value." The noise was both comforting and exhausting. Somehow, in this cacophony, the issue no longer felt like a private injustice. It felt like an argument that everyone could weigh in on. The HOA's immediate reaction was twofold: legal pressure and PR. They sent out a press release claiming the tank posed a safety risk and described a horror of children climbing on weaponized equipment, which was not how I presented the tank at all. It was decommissioned and supervised during neighborhood events. The board used emotional language to paint their opposition as one of public safety. At the same time, they filed a motion for emergency injunctive relief asking a court to order its immediate removal. Their letter to the county was a string of regulatory buzzwords designed to make municipal officers uncomfortable. What really got under my skin was the way they tried to control the narrative. They emailed neighbors about our community's character and sent out a glossy pamphlet about voluntary compliance. In one late-night forum post, someone on the board confessed that they were worried people would get ideas if the tank stayed. Get ideas? As if a community might want to take back a piece of itself without permission, that I decided to turn the narrative back on them. That I invited the community in for an old-fashioned block barbecue. That I made signs that said family memories matter and placed a small plaque on the tank reading remembrance. Do not judge without listening. The goal wasn't to mock, but to humanize. I wanted to show that the object, ridiculous as it was, represented a deeper truth about what it means to be allowed to keep what you love. People came in droves. Some brought casseroles, others came to argue. Children clambered on the tank with helmets we'd borrowed from a local bike shop. The local band played, and someone brought a cake. The tank became a backdrop for faces and voices and stories, and suddenly the issue stopped being a legal abstraction and became about people, about whether a neighborhood should be run by a committee more than by its residents. But legal machinations are patient. The HOA's injunction motion demanded a hearing, and the county, being a bureaucratic machine that feeds on paperwork, scheduled a hearing weeks out. In the meantime, more incidents happened. My mailbox was found smashed. One morning, the glass in my father's photo frame was cracked when I came home from court. A black SUV idled near my driveway on a series of nights, engine running, but without plates I could read. That kind of intimidation is corrosive. It's designed to make you feel watched and small. A friend suggested I install cameras. I did. Another suggested I sleep elsewhere. I didn't. I knew intimidation works best when you are alone and tired, when fear can grow roots in the silence you keep to yourself. One night, after a lengthy legal meeting and a press appearance, I returned home to find my neighbor on my porch, a woman who had watched the whole thing with wary distance, holding a plate of cookies. Her hair was a soft gray, and she had the kind of face that makes you trust her at once. "I don't want your war," she said quietly, "but I want to say something. You are standing up for everyone who's been bullied into silence. Don't forget to take care of yourself." It was the kind of small grace that keeps you human in the middle of chaos. Courts, as always, were slow. The judge, a woman with a steady hand, listened to both sides with an expression that said she'd seen stranger disputes. The HOA lawyer spoke in a litany about community property values and safety codes. My lawyer, the one who had taken my case on a shoestring retainer because he said power likes the quiet, spoke of rights and the social value of memory. The judge issued a temporary stay that allowed the tank to remain for now, but warned us that the county would require a hearing on the specifics of the code. While the legal machinery churned, the HOA escalated in other ways. They started a whisper campaign about zoning violations that somehow had my name attached to them. They complained to the utility company, which came out to inspect lines after someone reported a suspected violation, that I began to receive anonymous packages, things meant to unsettle. A single glove on my front step, a Polaroid of my backyard taken from across the street, a typed letter that read simply, "We can make it worse." The anger I'd felt at the beginning changed into a different heat. This wasn't a righteous rush anymore. This was a long, grinding stress that made the edges of my life thin as I watched the news. Sometimes I watched the headlines. Local man parks tank, divides community. The stories were uneven. Some reporters treated me as a lunatic, some as an underdog. The internet is a sieve that filters out nuance, leaving only the sharp shapes. At a point when the county was considering fines, and when the HOA was lining up campaign contributors for a public relations offensive, someone from the HOA called me in the middle of the night. His voice was tight. "We can make this stop," he said. "You can take it down quietly, that will drop charges, that you'll still live here." I could tell it was a negotiation dressed as a generous offer. "What are your terms?" I asked. He asked me to remove the tank, to apologize publicly, to promise not to do something familiar again. He wanted me to be quiet and penitent, to be a lesson for the rest of the neighborhood. I thought about it for a long time. The offer was attractive in its simplicity. Remove the spectacle and go back to normal. But normal, the one with the towing notices and the thinly veiled threats, had been the problem the whole time. I thought of my father's hands and how the car had smelled of oil and summer. I thought of the note that had warned me I'd made enemies. I thought of the elderly couple who'd baked cookies. I refused. "Then we will see you in court," he said, and the line clicked. The hearing finally arrived. The judge asked for specifics. She required a structural engineer's report on safety, an environmental assessment for leaks, and a determination on whether the tank constituted a structure that needed a specific variance. The county's code seemed to delight in complexity. We complied. We brought in experts who said the tank was inert, that it presented no immediate environmental risk, that on private property decommissioned vehicles could be displayed under certain conditions. The HOA brought in a parade of experts of its own, people who argued the aesthetic harm and the risk of dangerous precedent. The ruling was bittersweet. The judge allowed the tank to remain for the immediate term, but warned that future hearings could change that. She urged both parties to pursue mediation. It was a compromise that suited a judge who'd been taught to preserve peace and cling to precedent. The HOA declared a victory. I declared it a reprieve. Victory or reprieve, it changed things. The tank became an axis around which people argued not only about property, but about dignity. I was forced to confront the duality of what I had done. I had been brave and reckless in equal measure. The tank had become a living symbol of both the best and worst of me. And then, when I thought the story had reached a plateau, they struck in a way I never expected. The HOA found a legal technicality via the county's codebook that allowed them to file a lien on my property for alleged fines dating back years, many of which were spurious. Such a lien, even if contested, scared lenders and scared potential buyers away. Without warning, the bank that handled my mortgage called to ask questions, and an ordinary bureaucratic letter arrived suggesting that prolonged, unresolved financial disputes could trigger loan covenants. This is an ugly thing about fights like this. They don't remain spectacles. The slow machinery of finance can squeeze a house out of a person without the glare of cameras. It is the hushed, paper-based violence that scares you more than a shrill voice at a meeting ever could. I had to make a decision. The tank had done its work. It had called attention, but the attention meant I was under threat in ways that reached deeper than headlines. I called my lawyer. We convened. We calculated. We appealed. I started doing prep for a bigger move, one that would not only defend my property, but would change the stakes in ways the HOA had not anticipated. What happened next was both foolish and inevitable. I organized a weekend event. A demonstration, I suppose, but I called it a memory day. We invited community leaders, civil rights advocates, people from nearby towns who'd fought similar battles. We asked people to bring objects that mattered to them. We put them beside the tank as a way of showing what public space could hold if it was for people rather than paperwork. The turnout was massive. Cars lined the street, and people walked in with boxes of memory, an old recliner, a faded bicycle, a child's drawing. The tank was surrounded not by fear, but by the kinds of life that show how absurd it is to reduce people to rules. The photos of that day, kids on the tank, elderly neighbors swapping stories on folding chairs, a woman turning a wrench on a rusted bicycle, were the kind of images that can haunt a bureaucrat's phone in ways legal briefs never do. Yet the backlash intensified. Anonymous letters escalated to vandalism. Someone slashed the tank's canvas cover. Someone left a bag of nails by my driveway at night. I received a terse visit from an investigator representing a neighborhood association pointing out that the tank created an atmosphere which might depress property sales. Another call came from a utility company about a complaint regarding illegal signage. The war had become a million small conflicts stitched together. Social, legal, financial, emotional. I was exhausted. There were dinners I canceled. There were days I didn't answer the phone. I wasn't a hero. I was an exhausted man trying to keep something alive in a storm. And then came the real shock. A person, not in an HOA uniform, but in a plain shirt and a tone that sounded practiced, knocked on my door in the rain one evening. He said he represented a developer interested in buying the parcels adjacent to mine. He smiled and said, "We want to make the area more uniform. We can help you relocate. It'll be painless." I saw the motion for a takeover dressed as generosity. There are real powers at work when land and money mix. Sometimes community boards are a front for those with larger ambitions. Sometimes the polite men with nice hair are only interested if you will sell cheap. And if you refuse, they'll find other ways to make staying untenable. I told him the truth. I wasn't for sale. He didn't look surprised. He left a card. I kept it in the glove box of my car and only used it as a reminder of how far this would go. People ask me why I kept going, why I risked my finances, my privacy, my peace. And I tell them, because once you allow an institution to make a person vanish under the weight of rules, the next person they target may not have the stubbornness to resist. It's like a neighbor slowly being nudged to the curb because their tastes don't match a committee's memo. If you let the machine win on small things, it gets emboldened for larger ones. We found small victories along the way. A sympathetic reporter wrote a column that focused not on the tank, but on the story of a man refusing to be reduced to a line item. A local civil liberties group wrote to the county about a pattern of intimidation. An online petition gathered signatures. People who had stood quiet at the mailbox began to talk in grocery store aisles. But the outcome was never certain. The HOA had resources and connections. Their lawyers were patient. And each day the tank remained. The pressure mounted, like an ocean under a dam that holds only so long. And so I kept living in the eye of the storm, walking my dog past the tank at dawn, checking the perimeter cameras at midnight, making coffee in the morning as the world outside argued about my life. I learned how to sleep with a strategy in my head. I learned the strange skills of someone living under public scrutiny, how to speak with a microphone, how to sign affidavits, how to make a casserole, and a legal filing in the same afternoon. If this were only about a tank, it would be easier to laugh at the absurdity. But it wasn't. It was about what people with official titles can do when unchecked. It was about the way decisions meant to preserve community standards can become instruments of exclusion. It was about memory and pride and what one man will do to keep the last threads of his father from being tossed away. The story kept moving forward. We wanted more hearings. The HOA continued to file liens and counters. The county kept asking for more paperwork. And at times I wondered how I'd gotten this far and what the eventual cost would be. But when the day came that they tried something I hadn't expected, something that would force me into a position I never imagined, I understood that this fight had become larger than an object in my yard. It had become about how far a person will go when cornered and how far a community will allow the people it elected to control them. That chapter, when it came, would be ugly, and it would test every trust one had. And if you think the next part of this story is just another court date or another news clip, you're wrong. What came next changed everything. It was a moment where the quiet bureaucracy showed its teeth and where I realized the war was no longer only about property values. It was about survival. But that is for the next section. If you're still with me, good. Because the next act is darker, stranger, and more fraught than anything that's come before. And it will force a choice I thought I was ready to make until I realized what the consequences truly meant. I thought I'd seen the worst of it. The fines, the liens, the endless paperwork. But I hadn't. Because the HOA still had one weapon left, patience. And patience, when paired with power, is dangerous. Weeks blurred into months. Every day brought something new. Another letter taped to my door, another notice folded in legal language that seemed designed to exhaust me. One day, it was a noise violation because kids had laughed too loudly while climbing on the tank. Another day, it was an unsightly debris citation because I'd stacked firewood in a corner of my yard. It didn't matter how absurd the claims were. Each one demanded a response, and each response drained me further. I began to realize their tactic: bleed me dry. Not all at once, not with one big blow, but with 1,000 tiny cuts. They knew that most people fold under that kind of weight. They knew that fatigue breaks stronger men than fear. But I wasn't ready to fold. So I pushed back. Every violation, I answered. Every hearing, I showed up with evidence, witnesses, photographs. My lawyer warned me that I was making enemies in every direction. You're not just fighting the HOA, he said. You're fighting the system that props them up. And he was right. Because one morning, I opened my mailbox and found not a violation, but a letter from the county itself. They were investigating whether my property qualified as a nuisance site. If they decided it did, they could fine me daily, even seize control of the land. It was the kind of bureaucratic nuke that could end the fight in one stroke. That was the moment I realized the battlefield had shifted. This wasn't just about a tank anymore. It was about whether I had the right to resist. The intimidation got worse. At night, cars idled outside with their headlights off. Once, I caught a man taking photos through my fence. Another time, I woke up to find the words "sell" or "suffer" spray painted across my garage door in dripping black letters. It rattled me, I won't lie. Even the strongest conviction trembles when you feel hunted in your own home. There were nights I sat in the dark, holding my father's old wrench, listening for footsteps outside. Nights when the silence pressed so heavy on my chest, I thought I'd suffocate. And then, one night, it wasn't silent at all. A crash, glass shattering. I rushed to the living room, heart pounding. A brick lay on the floor, glass shards scattered across the carpet. Attached to the brick was a note. Next time, it won't just be glass. That was the first night I truly questioned if I'd gone too far. If maybe the tank had become less a symbol of resistance and more a beacon inviting danger to my door. I sat there, staring at the brick, wondering if I was reckless, if I was putting not just myself but my neighbors in danger. But then, I remembered why I started. I remember the look on my father's face the day we restored that old car together. The way he said, "Some things are worth fighting for, son, even when the fight isn't fair." I remembered how it felt when the HOA dragged my car away like it was nothing but scrap. That pain hadn't dulled. It had sharpened into something I couldn't ignore. So I decided, if they wanted a war of patience, I'd give them a war of endurance. I started documenting everything. Every violation notice. Every act of vandalism. Every late-night car parked outside my house. I bought cameras, storage drives, even hired a friend who worked in IT to secure my footage. If they wanted to intimidate me, I would turn their intimidation into evidence. And then I escalated. I went public, not just with local reporters, not just with neighbors. I went online. I told my story to national outlets, podcasts, forums filled with people who knew what it meant to stand up to petty tyrants. The clip of the tank in my yard went viral again. But this time, it wasn't just novelty. It was framed as a fight for property rights, for personal freedom, for the little guy standing up against the machine. And the more the story spread, the more the HOA panicked. Because they weren't just fighting me anymore. They were fighting public opinion. That's when the cracks began to show. Leaked emails surfaced. Neighbors who were secretly furious at the board. Board members who admitted privately that the fight had spiraled out of control. One message, sent from the HOA president himself, read, "We need to make an example out of him before others start pushing back." That email became my weapon. Proof that this wasn't about safety or property values or community harmony. It was about power. But the more ground I gained publicly, the more dangerous it became privately. One night, after a long interview with a journalist, I returned home to find the tank vandalized. Red paint slashed across the side, words scrawled in dripping letters. Traitor to the community. I stood there, fists clenched, staring at the desecration of what had become my symbol. And in that moment, I understood they weren't just trying to break me. They were trying to erase me. The next morning, I cleaned it off. Every stroke of the brush was an act of defiance. Every smear of paint washed away was a promise. I will not bow. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the question gnawing at me. How much longer could I keep this up? How many more battles before I broke? And then, just when I thought things couldn't get darker, the letter came. A formal notice, signed, sealed, and delivered. The HOA was filing for foreclosure on my home. Not because I hadn't paid my mortgage. Not because I owed the bank. But because of the fines they had stacked on me, month after month, violation after violation. Fines I had fought, fines I had appealed, fines I had proven false, but fines that, on paper, had grown into a number so outrageous it could strip my house away. I read that letter a dozen times, the words swimming in front of my eyes. And for the first time, I felt the ground shift beneath me. This wasn't just a fight for dignity anymore. This was a fight for my home. for the roof over my head, for the last piece of my father I had left. I set the letter down. I walked outside. I placed my hand on the cold steel of the tank, and I swore out loud to the night, to the neighbors who might be listening, to anyone who cared, that I would not surrender, no matter the cost, because this was no longer just my story. It was everyone's story who had ever been bullied, silenced, or stripped of what mattered most to them. And as the foreclosure hearing loomed, I knew the final battle was coming. One last stand, and I had to be ready. The foreclosure hearing was set for a Tuesday morning. I didn't sleep the night before. How could I? Everything I had fought for, everything I had endured, all of it balanced on the edge of that single day. If I lost, I wouldn't just lose the house. I wouldn't just lose the tank. I would lose my fight, my stand, my father's memory. I sat at my kitchen table in the dark, hands wrapped around a mug of cold coffee, staring at the letter over and over. The HOA believed they had me cornered, that I was too drained, too broke, too tired to resist. But they didn't know what I had. See, while they were building their case on fines and technicalities, I had been building mine on something stronger. Truth. Every video clip from my cameras, every photo, every harassing letter, every leaked email, I had cataloged it, time-stamped it, backed it up 3 times. And I had more than evidence. I had witnesses, neighbors who were fed up, who had been silent too long, but were finally ready to speak. That morning, I walked into the courthouse with my lawyer on one side and a folder so thick it barely fit in my hands. The HOA board was already there, sitting together in suits that looked too sharp, too smug. They smiled when I walked in. They thought the victory was theirs. But they didn't see the reporters in the back row. They didn't see the neighbors who'd shown up to watch. They didn't see the storm I brought with me. The hearing began like all hearings do, dry, procedural, weighed down by language designed to confuse and intimidate. The HOA's lawyer droned on about violations and community standards and financial obligations. They painted me as reckless, defiant, uncooperative. And then it was my turn. I stood. My voice shook at first, but it grew steadier with each word. I told the judge about my father's car, about how this fight began, about the endless fines, the harassment, the intimidation. I held up the photos of vandalism, the brick through my window, the graffiti sprayed across my garage. I showed the emails, that one damning line. We need to make an example out of him before others start pushing back. The judge's brow furrowed. The HOA lawyer stammered. And for the first time, I saw the smug smiles slip from their faces. But the moment that changed, everything came not from me, but from my neighbors. One by one, they stood and spoke. A mother who'd been fined for chalk drawings on her driveway. A veteran who'd been told to remove the flag from his porch. A widower who'd been cited for unapproved garden decorations at his wife's memorial. Their stories filled the room, echoing off the walls like cannon fire. By the time they finished, it wasn't just me against the HOA. It was the community. The judge leaned back, tapped his pen, and said words I'll never forget. This isn't about community standards. This is about abuse of power. The HOA's case began to crumble. The foreclosure threat was stalled, pending investigation. The board members whispered frantically, their faces pale. But even as relief washed over me, I knew this wasn't the end. Because power doesn't surrender quietly. In the days that followed, the story exploded. Headlines about the man who parked a tank to fight the HOA spread across the country. Some people laughed. Some cheered. Some criticized, but everyone was watching. And the HOA? They weren't done. Anonymous calls buzzed my phone late at night. Cars slowed outside my house, more now than ever. Rumors swirled about the board hiring private security, about them planning a counterattack. I could feel it. The fight wasn't over. It had only evolved. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky burned orange, I climbed onto the tank. I sat there, staring out across the quiet street, feeling the weight of it all. The cost, the danger, the uncertainty of what was coming. And that's when I noticed it. A letter slipped under my front door. No envelope, no stamp, just a single sheet of paper, typed in bold black letters. This isn't over. You've won the battle. But the war has just begun. I held that paper in my hands, the words burning into me. And I realized they were right. This wasn't the end of my story. This was only the beginning. So here I am, still standing, still fighting, still refusing to bow. Because some things are worth the cost. Some things are worth every scar, every sleepless night, every battle. And if you've made it with me this far, if you've listened to every word, felt every blow, carried every ounce of this fight with me, then I need you with me in what comes next. Hit that subscribe button right now, because trust me, you don't want to miss the next chapter. Because the HOA hasn't seen the last of me, and neither have you.